Hello, I'm glad you've joined us today as we continue to study the Gospel of Mark. Last time we saw where Jesus was arrested in the garden at the betrayal of Judas. And now we pick up in Mark 14 verse 53 with Jesus being taken before the Jewish council. It says in Mark 14 verse 53 that they led Jesus away to the high priest, and all the chief priests and the elders and the scribes gathered together. And Peter had followed him at a distance right into the courtyard of the high priest, and he was sitting with the officers and warming himself at the fire. Now the chief priests and the whole council kept trying to obtain testimony against Jesus to put him to death, and they were not finding any. For many were giving false testimony against him, and yet their testimony was not consistent. And some stood up and began to give false testimony against him, saying, "We heard him say, 'I will destroy the temple made with hands, and in 3 days I'll build another made without hands.'" And not even in this respect was their testimony consistent. And the high priest stood up and came forward and questioned Jesus, saying, "Do you make no answer? What is it that these men are testifying against you?" And he kept silent and made no answer. And again the high priest was questioning him and said to him, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One?" And Jesus said, "I am, and you shall see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven." Tearing his clothes, the high priest said, "What further need do we have of witnesses? You have heard the blasphemy. How does it seem to you?" And they all condemned him to be deserving of death. And some began to spit at him, and to blindfold him, and to beat him with their fists, and say to him, "Prophesy!" And the officers received him with slaps in the face. Here we see the terrible mockery of a trial that Jesus was going through. It's late in the night. It was late when Jesus was arrested in the garden. And now we see him before this Sanhedrin council, these chief priests and the high priest and the elders and the scribes. To understand this section, it's also important to realize what the other Gospels say. Jesus, when you look at all of it together, goes through two trials. One's called many times the ecclesiastical trial before these religious leaders, and then the second trial, a civil trial before Pilate and Herod. Each one of them has 3 stages. This so-called ecclesiastical trial, we see the preliminary hearing before Annas, and that's only recorded in John's Gospel. Annas had been high priest. He'd been deposed, and Caiaphas put in his place by the Romans, but the Jews still respected him and took Jesus to him first. Caiaphas is the son-in-law of Annas. A high priest was supposed to reign for life as the high priest, but the Romans would set up whom they wanted. So after taking him to Annas, we learn from the other Gospels, then he's taken to Caiaphas. Then later he would be taken for this civil trial to Pilate early in the morning. Then Pilate would send him to Herod, and then Herod would send him back to Pilate. But here, he evidently, what we're reading in Mark's account, we'll see that evidently the first part of this has already taken place, where he's already been taken to Annas, and Mark's recording where he's there before Caiaphas. Caiaphas occupied his office from AD 18 to AD 36. As we said, he's the son-in-law of Annas. We read that in John 18th chapter, I think, verse 13. He's a very rude, sly manipulator, an opportunist. He doesn't know the meaning of fairness or justice. He's been on having his way by hook or crook, and the people have been listening to Jesus. Jesus has put Caiaphas and his followers in their place, showing their hypocrisy. And the people love him, but Caiaphas and and these chief priests and scribes, these elders, they hate him. And we see their hypocrisy. It's very evident here, is the way they treat Jesus and how wicked and cruel and how crooked they are, and doing these things completely against the law. They claim to be concerned about the law and the law of God, and yet everything they're doing, they're breaking the law and have murder in their hearts. A good number of them, of this council, joins together, not just a few, but several of them. Most all of them are there. We probably want to think that possibly Joseph of Arimathea was not there. Later it says that they all agreed that he was worthy of death. It seems that Joseph has come past that, and when he sees him crucified, asked for his body. So maybe not all were there, but many were there, and they were participating in this. We read here in verse 54 that Peter, after they'd all fled, at least him and John, have come in closer now, following, but at a distance. He follows him right into the high priest's courtyard, and there sitting with officers and warming himself by the fire. The other disciple that's mentioned in John would be John himself, who also began to follow this band of people who's taken Jesus into the high priest's palace. In the case of Peter, following Jesus, he's prompted probably because of his loud boast that he wouldn't deny him, and he was following along to see what's going to happen, partly because of curiosity, but no doubt because of concern as well, and yet he's only following at a distance. There's a great lesson in that. When you follow your Lord at a distance, it's one thing to follow him closely and be there with him and do what he says and be proud to know him and not deny him in any way. But you follow him at a distance, you end up denying the Lord, and there's grave consequences. We must keep ourselves close to the Lord. Great lesson here, as we'll see from Peter. But the disciples here, John and Peter, we see how they get in when we go to John the 18th chapter. Simon Peter, as we said, was following at a distance, and so was this other disciple. But this other disciple, which is John, is known by the high priest. He enters in with Jesus into the court of the high priest, but Peter's standing at the door outside. So John, who is known to the high priest, went and spoke to the doorkeeper and brought Peter in. John tells us that. So they're both in, at least where they can hear and see, but still at a little bit of a distance. Peter, now been allowed to come in, is there with the officers and warming himself by the fire. These temple guard, these officers sort of be like policemen. He's there warming himself by the fire. The rest of them, most of them, probably went back to the fortress of Antonia, the fortress that was built there by Herod, that was right adjacent to the temple. But now the story turns to the trial of Jesus. You see in verse 55 there that the chief priest and the entire Sanhedrin were seeking evidence by which they might put Jesus to death. Now you think before they have a trial they'd have evidence, but they don't. They just hate him, and they've been looking for a way that they might kill him by stealth. And they thought that they couldn't do this during the feast, but Judas has given this opportunity to get him, and they're doing this at night undercover and in secrecy, away from the people, and they don't even have anything against. Of course, Jesus doesn't have any sin. He hadn't done anything wrong. The only thing that he's done to them is he's pointed out their hypocrisy. He's pointed out their sin, and they hate him for it. They don't have any evidence, and so here at the last minute they're looking for evidence, and not just any evidence, but evidence to put him to death. And some start bearing false testimony so that they'll have something to say, but even that doesn't agree. It's not consistent. It's clear to see that the scriptures blame the chief priests and the Sanhedrin, these Jewish leaders, for crucifying Jesus the Christ. He's absolutely sinless, and yet he's taken and tried by these wicked, sinful men. That in itself had to be great, deep humiliation. To be tried by such men in such circumstances just had to make it that much worse. They're greedy, serpent-like. This was Annas. He was a very wicked man. We've got this rude, sly, hypocritical Caiaphas. Later he's going to go before Pilate, who is crafty and superstitious and self-seeking Roman authority. And he's going to wash his hands of the whole thing and let justice go. And then you've got this immoral, ambitious, superficial Herod Antipas. And this was Jesus' judges. And here's one who done no wrong to God nor man. And these were his judges. The whole trial was a farce. It was really just a mistrial. There was no intention of giving Jesus any kind of fair hearing. That wasn't the point. They didn't have any evidence to start with. And they're just making up unfounded charges against him. And so really no trial ever conducted anywhere was any more shocking and unfair than this one. It was illegal, as we said, on several grounds. Here are men who are supposed to be men of the law, and they're not concerned about law. No trial for capital offense was to be allowed during the night, and yet Jesus was tried somewhere between the hours of 1 to 3 o'clock in the morning. Friday was executed on a feast day, which that also was forbidden. According to Pharisaical law, no hearings in a case involving capital punishment could even be initiated on the eve of a festival like the Passover, but it was. No conviction was allowed at night, and yet he was convicted, even though there was no evidence that he had done anything wrong. And to execute the sentence on the same day of when these things were done, or the next day, was all against the law. The arrest of Jesus was the result of a bribe, namely blood money that Judas had received. That was against the law. Jesus was asked by the high priest to incriminate himself. And in the cases of capital punishment, the Jew didn't permit the sentence to be pronounced until the day after the accused had been convicted, and they broke that law. There was just law after law after law that they're breaking, but they're not concerned about the law. Everything they're doing is wrong. It's all because of their hatred. They're filled with rage. This new prophet had laid them bare. All their hidden motives, all their selfishness and hypocritical acts had been pointed out right there in the temple before the people. And the people loved Jesus for it. But these men hated him, and they hated him so much they were willing to do anything that they could to kill him. So some stood up, giving their false testimony, misrepresenting, misquoting Jesus. Jesus didn't say that he would tear down the temple made with hands and in 3 days build it up, make one without hands. He said destroy this temple in 3 days, I'll raise it up. And he was speaking to the temple of his body, which they didn't understand. They didn't try to understand. But this is not what Jesus said. Caiaphas rises up there in verse 60 and asks him, well, what do you answer? Trying to get him to incriminate himself and ask his own questions about himself. Of course, Jesus didn't say anything. He could have exposed them totally, all these, the unwarranted character of these accusations about destroying the temple. But he knows very well the purpose of this trial. It's not to know what's right. It was just to work against him, to try to kill him. And he's allowing that. He's in control, and He's allowing it to happen. We remain silent. When it seems that the trial may turn out to be a failure because they have no evidence, they can't even get people to agree on what they are trying to say against Jesus as they give their false testimony. Caiaphas is anxious, and he gets to the point of asking the main question, and that is, are you the Son of Man? And he asks him, are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed? Or he's asking, are you the Son of God? And that's what's stated there in Matthew's account. And he puts him to the weightiest oath, namely by the living God. Or will you say that that's who you are, by the living God? As Matthew says in Matthew 26. He demands a clear, straightforward answer. And he's asking, do you claim to be the Messiah? Do you claim to be the Son of God? And Jesus there in verse 62 says, I am. And you shall see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power, coming on the clouds of heaven. He said, I am. He is God. He's the Son of God. The Son of God with power. And the high priest, he just can't take that. Even though everything that Jesus taught, everything that Jesus did by His power and miracles pointed to that very fact. These signs, as John calls them in his gospel, these miraculous works pointed to the fact that Jesus was the Christ, the Son of God. And they would see with power. When He was raised from the dead, Jesus would show Himself to be the Son of God with power. Romans chapter 1 and verse 4 says it proved Him to be the Son of God with power. And they would see that. But here the high priest, in his hypocrisy, tears his clothes and says, do we have any need of any witnesses? They didn't have any evidence. And Jesus just stated the truth about Himself, that He is the Christ, the Son of God, which His teaching and His miracles pointed Him to be. And He says, well, do we have any need for any? They don't need any evidence. They don't need any witnesses. He said, this is good enough. He's blasphemed. And they ask everybody, what do you think? And they all say in answer that He's deserving of death. And the verdict was unanimous. Mark tells us there in verse 56 then that they are jubilant in their wickedness. And they start to spit at Him, and they blindfold Him, and they strike Him with their fists. And they say to Him, prophesy. In other words, prophesy who hit you. And they kept beating Him. These honorable members of the Sanhedrin, the religious leaders of the Jews, show their true, cruel, and vengeful, and sadistic character. They claim to be religious, and yet they're inhumane, they're base, they're contemptible. And what a terrible day it will be when they stand before God to give answer for what they did to His Son. Remember, Peter is just outside watching and listening, and he will end up denying Him. And that's where we'll pick up next time. A lot of things to consider, especially when we look at this, see how Jesus is treated, to realize what He went through for us. It's a terrible thing to be the sacrifice for sin, for our sin, so that we might have salvation. Hope that you'll consider these things. I hope that you'll be back with us and study with us again. Till then, I hope you have a good day.